you, Julianne, and welcome everybody to the third scheduled lecture in the course Life in the Extreme. Last week, as you know, some of us were here hoping for a talk last week, and we unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute. So before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to let you know that the rescheduled date will be October 27th. Which is a Thursday, so not a Wednesday, but it will be at the same time, and it will be in the Oak Room at 1:30. So please join us for Dr. Crow's lecture next Thursday if you can make it. All right, so our speaker today is Dr. David Blackburn, who joined us last semester to talk about how the Florida Museum of Natural History is making scientific collections more accessible to everyone using 3D imaging techniques via I believe, the Open Vertebrate or OVERT project, of which he is principal investigator. The images, I looked at some of them online, they're really fantastic. And I hope if you all haven't seen some of these before, go hit the Florida Natural History Museum's website and search OVERT. And they're pretty spectacular. Dr. Blackburn serves currently as the curator of amphibians and reptiles at the Florida Museum of Natural History and as the associate chair of the museum's Department of Natural History, and is also affiliate faculty in the UF's Department of Biology, Tropical Conservation and Development Program, School of Natural Resources and Environment, and Center for African Studies. He received his PhD from Harvard University and bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. And over the past 2 decades, he and his lab have explored the diversity of amphibians from around the world through molecular genetics, digital anatomy, fossils, museums, and field research in tropical Africa. Today, Dr. Blackburn will be speaking to us on his use of high-resolution X-ray imaging to show us what he's discovered about the inner workings of frog heads built for a range of ecological specializations. So welcome back, Dr. Blackburn. And I see you're going to have some show and tell for everybody too. So looks like it'll be fun. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice. Oh, sorry, am I too loud?
That's okay, I'll keep going down.
Okay, good. All right, great. Thanks. Nice to be back. Nice to see familiar faces, which is great. So thank you.
Ready?
Yeah, whenever you're ready. I think it's already, yeah.
Oh, wait, who's this guy? Okay, hold on. Get that.
I think it's, oh, just here.
Okay,
It's on the desktop.
one moment.
There it is, right there.
My apologies.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about, for lack of a better topic, frog heads. It's probably something none of you have ever thought seriously about. It's fine. And really what I wanted to highlight were just things that are happening. There we go.
Okay.
Great. Things that are happening in my lab. And some of the things that we've done the last few years. And actually, can you just click to make sure it's on the slide? And there we go.
Okay.
All right, we're good. Yeah, we're all good. All right, so we will, let's see, where do I begin? So I am, as we stated, curator, professor in the Natural History Museum. I oversee the amphibian and reptile collection. So we have about 200,000 preserved specimens. That's mostly things in jars, but also skeletons. We're actually in the process right now of moving all of our alcohol collections. So that's amphibians, reptiles, fishes, invertebrate zoology, and miscellaneous birds and mammals, all the way across campus to a new building that's behind the public museum. So if you look at the Performing Arts Center and the public museum, right in between them, there's a walkway that goes out to the Natural Areas Teaching Lab. And right back there now, there's a big, beautiful new building that is only for the alcohol collections of the Florida Museum of Natural History. So we're actually right now in the process of moving an enormous amount of stuff all the way across campus. But hopefully in the future, we'll be able to actually give tours of that space as well. It's nice that it's situated right by the public museum. And you can see, if you come, more of actually what we do behind the scenes. So the frog. The frog, most of you probably have an idea of what a frog looks like. One of the interesting things about frogs is that you could take any of us and put us pretty much as a species of humans anywhere on the world going back the last 200 million years, and we would have no problem identifying a frog when we saw them. Frogs have looked like frogs for a very long time. And this is your basic froggy frog. We're used to thinking about frogs having some very simple anatomical features, right? They have a big head for their body size. They don't have a tail. They have really large limbs. In fact, when we look at their skeleton in a second, we'll see that there's some other specializations, but they're really these sort of an exercise in simplicity, right? They're really a quite sort of body-wise, a simple animal relative, even to salamanders or lizards, right? There's a lot less of them present. And you probably don't think about extremes of frogs, but what I'd like to walk you through are some examples of really the very different types of frogs that there are, mostly with a focus on the heads today. And then also show you a little bit of how we're trying to actually understand how frogs do what they do by using both internal anatomy as well as some functional studies and actually seeing animals moving to understand a little bit more about how it is they do what they do. So as an amphibian biologist, this is an exciting time. So as a community, a global community of amphibian scientists, we are describing approximately 150 new species of amphibians every year. It varies by the year, but on average, there's about 3 new species a week, which is really remarkable when you think. So now most of those new species are in fact frogs. That's because the vast majority of amphibians are frogs. There are 2 other main types. So there's frogs, and by frogs I mean frogs and toads. There's salamanders, and by that I mean salamanders and newts. And then the third group are usually less well known by most people. Those are the caecilians. These are blind, tend to be blind, which is where the root of the word Sicilian refers to, not from an island in Italy. So caecilians are burrowing. They don't have limbs, and they live in the tropics. I used to say they don't live in the United States, except now there's actually some that live in the water in the canals of Miami. So even in Florida now we have this group of animals, which is strange. So there's a lot of amphibians out there. We've surpassed the number of living mammal species quite a while ago. And this is exciting as a biologist, not just simply because these are names on a list, which of course they are, but also because every time we discover a new species, we're discovering new aspects of biology as well, right? Different shapes, sizes, behaviors, types of reproduction. And that's really the bread and butter of what I work on. I'm sort of interested in all of that diversity and how it can be. So I work on frogs. This is a quick snapshot of all those various types of frogs that you can find out there in the world. There's a lot of species, so more than 7,500 species. In a few years, I expect this to pass 8,000 species. We have species, colorful tree frog species like these, or very large tree frog species. These actually have hands that can expand and they sort of parachute out of trees. We have small frogs that live in the leaves like these. We have very large-headed frogs, which we'll spend some time talking about here. There are sit-and-wait predators that are waiting for their prey to go by before they jump at them and grab them, and lots of shapes and sizes in between. So this diversity in terms of shapes and sizes and anatomies and reproductions is really what drew me to work on frogs, because it provides us a lot of interesting opportunities for asking questions about how and why do we see what we do in nature. One of the things that's most exciting, I'll come back to that. One of the things that's most exciting is that we often see the same type of frog evolve independently. So we often get multiple chances to see, what is it that leads to tree frogs evolving? Actually, what we think of as tree frogs as a type of animal out in nature are not actually all closely related to each other. Evidence would suggest many evolved being a tree frog many times independently across frogs. That's great from a statistical point of view, right? Because if there was only one of them, it's kind of hard to know, what are the factors leading to this one instance. But the more we have these replicates in nature, the more we kind of begin to understand more about what led to these certain types of animals being how they are. So frogs have been pretty important for biology outside of sort of the field that I work in. There's more than a dozen Nobel Prizes that use frogs of some kind in their research. We were just talking about squid in space. So the very first vertebrate animal ever born in space and returned were actually frogs. Better than that, they're actually African frogs. Those are the African clawed frogs that have been used in biomedical research since the 1930s. The very first cloned vertebrate, it was not Dolly the sheep, it was a northern leopard frog. So frogs continue to be of interest in sort of the larger picture of biomedical research. So for instance, one of those groups of frogs you probably never heard of, but actually are used in biomedical research are wood frogs. So wood frogs have the really neat ability to freeze solid, stop their hearts beating, thaw, and come back to life, which is an incredible trick. And obviously of interest for biomedical sciences. So there's a lot of, you might have heard, if you're interested in biomedical science, about African clawed frogs, which are used widely, especially for people interested in the earliest stages of development and what happens in the egg. There's actually a lot of other frogs out there that are also used in biological research that relate in some ways to what we think about for sort of human health, human medical science. So here's a frog skeleton. There's not much to it. They have many fewer bones in their skeletons than we have. And I just want to quickly introduce you to a few features because they will come up in the talk. So here's a head. You'll notice that relative to the rest of its vertebral column, which frogs usually only have 9 vertebrae in their backbone. That's it. Their head is basically the entire size of their vertebral column. So you could imagine how different I would look if my skull was the same size as the rest of my vertebral column. Which would be comical, but that's right. That's what frogs look like. It's a pretty comical animal when you think of it that way. They also have incredibly large legs relative to the size of their head. You imagine the size of my foot relative to my head. You know, I'd have enormous clown feet relative to the size of my head. There's also a lot of simplifications. So for instance, this bone here in us is 2 bones. That's these 2 bones here. They're fused together. Same for the bones that are here in the arm. There's a lot of loss of bones, simplification and fusion of bones. So there's really, you know, they are this exercise in simplification. Even though they're highly specialized to do a type of thing, and normally we think about that as jumping and leaping, but not all frogs are good jumpers, which we'll come back to. A lot of the skeleton has been really, really simplified. The other thing that's kind of neat for me as a biologist is that we have these sort of types of frogs that are very easy for us to recognize and pick out, right? We have frogs that are these sort of squat, fat frogs with tiny little arms, things that are great swimmers, things that are great climbers, things that sort of walk around the ground and don't really hop or leap. And you know, it's easy for us to look at nature and actually recognize these distinct groups. And what's neat is that you know, there's lots of examples of these out there, right? There's different types of tree frogs, different types of aquatic frogs. And these frogs, you know, superficially in each of these pairs look quite similar to each other. What's quite interesting is that in every one of these pairs that's up here, they shared a common ancestor before the origin of mammals, right? So these similarities that we see out there have an incredibly ancient history to them, because frogs have been around a very long time. And so that time scale of evolution is also something that I'm interested in, because it provides us opportunities for asking about, you know, have major extinction events been important for thinking about the evolution of, say, tree frogs? The other thing that's kind of amazing about frogs is that, you know, this slide here is true for adult frogs, right? We see these similarities of aquatic frogs and tree frogs, walking frogs. We actually see the same thing in tadpoles. There's a remarkable diversity of tadpoles out there in the world, which this will be my only slide about tadpoles. But one of the things that's fascinating is that it's very hard to pick up a tadpole and predict what its frog will look like. And in the same way, it's very hard to pick up an adult frog and predict what a tadpole will look like. They're actually quite different from each other. So there's tree frogs that are tree frogs as adult that have many different types of tadpoles to get to that type of tree frog body form. So these things sort of are almost independent of each other, and how that works, how do you go through so many different types of tadpoles but still get to the same body form as an adult is fascinating, perplexing sometimes, and an interesting topic for research. So I know this is kind of hard to read, but I'll just get to the main point. So this is an evolutionary tree, a phylogeny, a representation of how all frogs are represented. And there's sort of 2 or 3 main things to take away from. So one is there's a dotted line here. This red dotted line that goes up, this is the extinction of the dinosaurs. So if you go to the right, this is now. To the left, this is the past. So the origin of frogs is way back here. This is the common ancestor of just the living frogs. So we're not talking about extinct groups of frogs that aren't represented. There's frogs today on Earth, like the tailed frogs of the Pacific Northwest, that seem to have last shared a common ancestor with, say, a tree frog that we find in Gainesville more than 200 million years ago, which is really kind of astounding, both because they all are easily identifiable as frogs, right? Like we look at them, we don't have any issue identifying them as frogs. So they sort of had this body form for a very long time. And also a lot of what we think about in frog diversity that we see outside actually has a really deep antiquity to it. You know, these things are happening well before there were mammals, well before there were birds. You know, this time scale of frog evolution is pretty vast. In a very general sense, you know, it seems that frogs evolved, and the earliest frogs were sort of high latitude. They're in Europe and Asia. That's where a lot of the early lineages of frogs are found today, as well as a lot of frog fossils. And at some time in the time of the dinosaurs, there was the supercontinent in the south, Gondwana, where South America and Africa were together. And as they split apart, so did frogs. So we ended up with this large radiation of frogs that includes things like poison dart frogs, toads, tree frogs that you're familiar with in Gainesville, and this big other radiation of frogs that was in Africa. And this radiation includes things like the bullfrogs that we see outside today. And so this sort of deep division between the separation of South America and Africa has an imprint on the diversity that we see even outside of this building today. The other thing that's kind of neat, and easier to see without this on here, is you'll see that right here to the left of this dotted line, there's not a lot of branches, but that right after the dotted line, there's a lot of branches that happen. It seems that that's possibly a signal of a mass extinction event happening, a trimming of branches happening at the extinction of the dinosaurs, which probably led to the extinction of lots of other things around it at the same time. But that shortly thereafter, there became this sort of explosion of new lineages forming. And what's kind of interesting is that most of the frogs that we have in North America, all are from these groups that evolved after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And in fact, all of them seem to have come to North America from somewhere else. So for instance, the tree frogs that make a lot of noise outside that people are having questions about, even Cuban tree frogs, those all originated in South America and came into North America only, well after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Frogs that include things like bullfrogs and wood frogs, those only came into North America well after the extinction of dinosaurs and actually came from Eurasia, coming from probably Eastern Asia, colonizing North America. So even though there's been fossil frogs in North America going back almost 200 million years, the frogs that were here in the past and the frogs that are here today are actually completely different groups. There seems to have been this turnover of the types of frogs, mostly associated with the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's fascinating. So let's talk about some extreme frogs. So this is your typical general frog. It's what probably most comes to mind when people think about frogs. But this is a frog. So is this. This is also a frog. And what's kind of neat is that these are not just two examples. These are not just singletons. Like there's not only one frog that looks like this, one frog looks like this. We actually see these same types of frogs again and again across frogs, where we have lots of these tiny-headed, pointy-headed frogs, lots of these really big-headed frogs, and an assortment of these sort of in-between frogs. And so this pattern is interesting. We're interested in sort of what, at least from the front end of the frog, what leads to this diversity of these animals. Like this frog here, this frog actually has its joint of its jaw behind its head, part of the way down its vertebral column. I mean, they have massive mouths, massive heads. This is a frog that's jaw joint is actually in front of its eye, right? So they're completely different, right? Very different animals. We're interested in, what are these animals doing? What are the factors leading to seeing these forms again and again when we look across the tree of life of frogs? So your typical frog, and I'm just going to kind of focus on these extreme big-headed frogs for a minute. Your typical frog is one like this. They have these sort of lightly built, sort of gracile frogs. I have some 3D printed frog skulls that just to give you a tangible sense of what they look like. You know, these sort of lightly built skulls. And then you have these frogs that have, these look more like alligator skulls, or they look like the skulls of extinct amphibians that really are not related to modern amphibians at all. You know, what is leading to having these really large, heavy-bodied, you'll even see sculptured, there's all of this texture and extra ossification, extra bone and mineralization across these skulls. What is leading to these? So two of the things that have been hypothesized to lead to this are quite different aspects of biology. One is feeding on large prey. So this is a frog skull, and some of these big-headed frogs have massive jaw muscles. Why? Probably because they're spending a lot of time eating frogs. So this is a frog with a frog sticking out of its mouth, right? A frog is almost the same size. These are its hind limbs coming out of this frog's mouth. Another interesting thing that some frogs do that have these skulls is they actually use their skulls for defense. They use them to plug holes. So this is the tree frog that has a heavily wide skull and is actually using its skull to block a tree hole and prevent a predator from pecking and seeing the rest of his body. So it's using its head basically as a shield. Here is an example of a frog that has basically a giant shield as a head. In order to sort of ask some of the questions we do in the lab, I just, as was mentioned in the introduction, a lot of what we do depends on this large scale project where we've been imaging museum specimens from around the world. So we've got thousands of specimens, things that can be 3D printed. They're all available online. Many of these are just high resolution CT scans or other types of models that we've created in the lab. And we've done this not just for frogs, but for really all across vertebrate diversity. So that was what I talked about in August. So we use the data that come from this project a lot for asking questions like this. So this is a grad student, Dan, who recently finished his PhD. You know, we were able to take all of these images of frog diversity and sort of capture, you know, what are the major axes, you know, what are the major ways in which frog skulls are really different, whether they're 2 groups, 1 group, 5 groups, and really have a broad brush look across frog evolution, which previously has not been possible because it's very hard to bring all of these skulls into one place for studying, but we can do that digitally. And what we find is that there's really 4 big types of frog skulls, which have all kind of already been introduced. We find your normal skulls. You find your pointy-headed skulls, where, you know, this is the eye, this is the jaw joint, just for reference. So they're basically these little tiny mouths. We find big-headed frogs like this, which is the jaw joint, which is actually behind where the head touches the vertebrae. So huge mouths, tiny mouths. But we find this other group of frogs that have these broad heads. This is a lot on this slide, but I just want to point out 2 things. So you'll see green circles and orange circles. The main thing to take away is that there's many orange circles and a few green circles. Each of these circles represents an independent evolution of, in the case of orange, the big-headed frogs. So we have lots of these big-headed frogs that have evolved independently across the tree of life, and a handful of these flat-headed frogs, these green ones. What we find from this is that most of the time when we see the evolution of these big-headed frogs, it's because they specialize on eating vertebrates. They eat other frogs. If a bird is dumb enough to sit in front of one of these big-headed frogs, they will eat a bird. They will eat small mammals. So they're really these big sit-and-wait predators, and those have actually happened many times in evolution to find that strategy of living. We only find a few instances across the tree of these ones that are in green, where they're using their heads as a shield, but it does happen a few different times in frog evolution. The other thing I'll just point out is these are all the pointy-headed ones. Lots and lots and lots and lots of these losses of, or these tiny mouths that keep happening across the tree of life. So one of the things that this led us to think about was, you know, why do we get these sort of dainty little skulls? They're really kind of remarkably strange. We think about them as simple, not really specialized. But we started seeing how many times they sort of appeared independently across the frog tree of life. And we're curious about asking questions. And one of the most distinctive things about them is that they don't have any teeth. You've probably not thought about frogs having teeth. So there's actually, all frogs lack teeth on their lower jaw, but most frogs have teeth on their upper jaw, which in itself is really quite strange. Now, there's not many animals that have that pattern where they only have them in the upper jaw, not in the lower jaw. There are frogs that lack teeth in both places, but really there's not been a summary of that. So one of the things we did in the lab with all of these digital data now available to us was trying to sort of get some perspective on, how and why are frogs losing teeth? It seems like, it seems like an adaptation, an advantage to have teeth, as vertebrates have teeth for a very long time. Why lose teeth? And how many times has this happened in frogs? So let's see where we go. Okay, so this is just to give you a quick sense. These are all skulls from the right side. This is a frog with teeth. So it has teeth on its upper jaw, that's these bones, no teeth on its lower jaw, has a few teeth on the roof of its mouth. This is a frog that has no teeth. So these are the same bones. You can see the bones look very similar to each other, but teeth on one case, no teeth here. And this is a salamander and a caecilian for reference. And you'll see all salamanders and caecilians have teeth. There's actually no instances of these other amphibian groups ever losing teeth. If you look across vertebrates as a whole, there's actually only a handful of times that vertebrates have lost teeth. There's a couple cases in fish, the most famous of which are the pipe fishes and seahorses. None of those have teeth. There's all turtles lack teeth, so there's no turtles that have teeth. We believe that happened once in evolutionary time. Same with birds. No birds have teeth, but we believe that sort of happened once in evolutionary time. And there's a few groups of mammals that lack teeth. Things like the pangolin here, whales lack teeth. There's a few examples of toothless frogs, but only really 3 different groups that have lost teeth. There's actually no example of lizards and snakes that have lost teeth. Even in ones that have just tiny teeth, still have teeth. So they've never actually eliminated their teeth. And this is kind of neat in the world of understanding development and genetics, because especially for mammals, they've really been thinking about teeth as a complex structure and why you lose them and what happens to the genes involved in making teeth and the processes of development involved in making teeth when you start losing them. How do these systems decline and fall apart? It's actually been an interesting tool for understanding what happens in the developmental genetics when things begin to fall apart anatomically. The thing that's really spectacular about frogs is they've actually lost teeth maybe more than 20 times independently. And in all of these cases, there are things that eat extremely tiny prey. And this seems to have happened. Many different groups of frogs sort of have adopted this, I'd say, rather extreme lifestyle of specializing only on ants and termites, mostly. Sometimes there's frogs that specialize on eating mites and eat extremely tiny prey. How exactly that's related to losing teeth is a little unclear, but I will say that in some other groups like mammals, some groups of mammals that specialize in eating ants, they also end up losing teeth. It seems like probably you don't spend a lot of time grinding teeth. And it's probably not an adaptation to lose teeth, but it's probably not a lot of reasons to maintain teeth. So if there's mutations that happen that cause teeth to not fully develop, those things basically are permissible because there's not a lot of strong selection to keep those teeth. So we see a lot of these losses of teeth. And what does that look like in an actual frog? Oh, this is a bad one. Sorry, when I converted the PowerPoint. Let's see. It'll stabilize in a second. Here's a cute little frog. It's found itself a buffet, trance. And we have a lot of these little frogs that will find spots like this, camp out, and eat all they want of these tiny prey. They eat an enormous number of these tiny prey. Some of these frogs are actually specialized to smell to ants, like ants. So they will live inside ant mounds or termite mounds, and they get away with that because they're chemically giving off the smell of being an ant to other ants. They effectively live at the buffet all the time. Right? So these are quite neat groups of frogs. And we see, a lot of frogs will eat insects. That's what most frogs eat. But we see this tendency again and again and again to eat these extremely tiny prey. And when they do, they tend to get these very pointy heads, these little tiny mouths, and they lose all the teeth in their heads. Just kind of neat. There is an exception. Sorry, this is actually sort of from a research talk, so it's a little bit. But there's actually a group of frogs, one species, that has true teeth on its lower jaw. After 200 million years of frogs not having teeth, for some reason, one frog suddenly had teeth. When I had a grad student, we were kind of talking through this, we thought, well, maybe they're not real teeth. Maybe there's some other weird pseudo thing that's not actual teeth. So we threw a lot at this, which included like histology and CT scanning and looking at the distributions of proteins that are involved in making teeth. And pretty much everything you throw at it shows, in fact, these are real true teeth. How does this happen? I don't have an answer for it, but I can tell you that I have the same student, Dan, who published his work, now has a postdoc fellowship that's all about tooth development and tooth evolution. To begin trying to ask some more mechanistic questions. How is this possible? That seems very hard to believe that this could happen, and only in one single species. It's also, I'll just add, a little poignant working on amphibians. So despite the fact that we describe new species every week, many species are extinct. This happens to be an extinct species of frog that has not been seen in the wild since the late 80s. So actually being able to do experimental work is impossible on frogs. So the only way that we can actually begin asking these questions is from using specimens that happen to be in museums. That's really the only way we can do that. And I will add, in terms of describing new species, we already are in the business of describing species as new that we think are already extinct. It's basically a form of recent paleontology, species that we only know of because they exist in museum collections. We finally have recognized that, oh, that's a new species, but in fact, that species seems to have already been gone, already disappeared from the wild. So you're going to go back to these four big types of frog skulls. We have these extreme types like the pointy-headed ones that tend to burrow underground. They tend to eat ants. They all lack teeth. We get these really giant-headed frogs at the other end of the spectrum that tend to have these fangs. They either have true teeth on their lower jaw, so that big-headed frog that actually has true teeth on its lower jaw also eats vertebrates. So we have these sort of extremes in frog diversity of the pointy-headed ant specialists and the big-headed vertebrate specialists, and of course, things in between. One of the things that was actually quite interesting doing this work was how little data we have out there in the world. So I'm often, I talk to school groups all the time, and the types of questions that 8-year-olds ask me seem very basic. Like, what does it eat? And remarkably, for many groups of frogs, we have no idea. There is no, can we hypothesize that they eat invertebrates? Of course, that's what most of them eat. But in terms of the specifics, like does this species of frog depend on a particular species of grasshopper? Unknown. We don't have that type of information. So that includes when we did this review of trying to kind of tie together the loss of teeth to diet. We went through, because it was during COVID, we all had nothing to do. We spent a lot of time reading the scientific literature as a lab. There's like 15 of us doing this work online. Found that there's whole families of frogs for which there's never actually been a record of what it eats. There's really diverse groups, a genus like this group from Australia that has more than 70 species, never published. Australia, I'll note, is a place full of herpetologists like myself, and yet still there's groups like this that we don't know. It also includes this guy, red-eyed tree frogs. This, this appears on like calendars and beach towels, and yet the whole genus has never had a record of what they actually eat in the wild. Now, this is not groundbreaking science to do this type of work. It's very basic science. But, these little observations that are important for the biology and natural history of this species, when we're trying to ask these questions across all of the tree of life and what explains some of the patterns we see, we rely really heavily on this basic natural history to begin explaining those patterns. So there's a real need for it. So this is also something that we do a lot in the lab. I always tell my grad students, we have the type of science that gets you jobs and the types of science that 8-year-olds care about. Both those things are important and valuable. And you really can't do the bigger picture stuff without the little picture stuff. And so we often try to have a balance of those projects in our lab. Sometimes even when we CT scan stuff, we find interesting diet records. And sometimes these are species that we know from 1 or 2 specimens at all. So these are our records of what these animals eat. It's just these things in museums. So how do frogs eat? This is kind of fun. So this is my student Rachel, who just finished. She's now postdocing on Holyoke. Here's a cane toad. This is a big toad. This toad's about this big, about the size of an American football. I'm gonna let it go again. So here's some things to pay attention to. One, once the frog closes its mouth, it looks like it's done. All right. Another is that when it opens its mouth, slowly, take a second here. You see it slowly breathe. Oh, I think I have to re-click on it actually, sorry. You see when a frog breathes, when you see this movement on the bottom, that's actually using its throat muscles to pump air in and out of its nose. So that's what's happening on the bottom. These are crickets, a typical normal food. A cricket's probably about an inch long. So when it opens its mouth, in a moment, you'll see it happens. This is at very high speed, that's slowed down, obviously. It stretches its tongue way out, closes, and then it looks like it's done. We were really interested in what is actually happening inside the frog's mouth when it does this. How does it swallow? How does it move its tongue? You think about when you close your mouth, there's a lot of action that happens once your mouth is closed. We actually don't really understand what's happening inside a frog's mouth. And it's interesting, the frog scientists, because there's actually a lot of complex anatomy inside a frog's head that, as describing new species, we might point to and say, well, that seems interesting, that seems interesting. That's how you tell these species apart. We actually don't really understand why it's important. We don't understand what those pieces of anatomy actually do and how they vary between species. So here's a different view. I'll pause to explain this. So this is an X-ray, obviously. This is a X-ray over which we overlaid a 3D model of a frog skull. On top of all of it are these little red dots. These little red dots actually represent metal beads, very, very dense beads. So this animal was anesthetized, had little beads attached to it either on the outside of its head or surgically implanted in different parts, so that we could actually watch what was happening with certain pieces of the anatomy inside as it was feeding. And this is, again, a high-speed video. And I'm going to actually play it twice, just to give you a sense of it, and then the second time tell you what to look for. So you'll see it begin moving. It happens quite quick. An entire sort of a cycle of feeding is about a second and a half. It'll happen, I promise. There you go. The tongue comes out, whack, and you'll see there's a little red bead in the tongue. It comes back in, and the frog swallows. All right, so that's sort of what these look like. But then what I'm going to do is I want you to pay attention to this bead. I'm going to rewind it. That bead is actually implanted in the tip of the tongue. So when it comes out, you'll see it hit the cricket, which is this little dark spot right here. So that suddenly there'll be a bead that whacks. Oh, there it is. When it comes out, that bead goes back in. Wait, the tongue, that's the tip of the tongue. The tip of the tongue is actually behind its head. What is super weird? We didn't anticipate seeing something like that, and you'll watch. It's still here. This is behind the skull. This is the tip of the tongue. And it slowly returns to where it's going. This is very unexpected. We've actually never known what happens when a frog closes its mouth. And this is true not only for frogs, but for lots of animals, right? Lots of animals, it's very hard to study what is happening inside of them while they're doing something. Even for things that seem so familiar as, a tongue of a frog, right? Like probably any of you, if I'd asked before this talk, like, tell me something about frogs, I'm sure that a sticky tongue that they throw out of their mouth would have come up in the discussion, right? It's a very familiar aspect of their biology. But until this video, there was actually never evidence of what happens then. So this is a cartoon drawn by my student Rachel, where the tongue comes out, it brings the cricket back into its mouth, and then it sort of actually goes down its throat and sort of hits into like a glove. It brings the cricket all the way back, like it's catching it here, and then it scrapes the cricket off the roof of its mouth. That's why that tip of the tongue is still there for a little while. It's actually pinching it off, putting the tongue back to rest, and getting that cricket off that super sticky tongue. This is really interesting because it makes us think about frog tongues differently. It makes us think about the mechanics of these sort of complicated systems. And there's actually not another group of vertebrates I know that actually does swallowing like this. And I know this sounds a little far-fetched, but there's a lot of research out there about how do animals swallow, because we are interested in how we swallow and the sort of variations of human swallowing, how that relates to anatomy, the function relates to anatomy. So finding new examples of animals doing things in quite unexpected ways sometimes opens up opportunities for asking questions like that. And I'll just show kind of an interesting fact is this is the sort of centimeters between 3.5 centimeters, 5.5 centimeters that represents how far the tongue goes out of the mouth. Sometimes it's close because the cricket is close. Sometimes it's far away because the cricket is far away. But what's remarkable is that sometimes the tongue stretches farther backwards than it did forwards. Because sometimes if a cricket is right here and it comes back in, it actually stretches farther behind the head than it did going over the mouth. Which is really remarkable. Like it leads us to think about frog tongues and what they're doing in a completely new way. The other thing just to highlight is that this is the visible part of what happens when it actually opens its mouth and captures cricket. This is everything else. So this is really only about a fifth of the entire cycle of feeding, of catching something and swallowing. Now we actually have these abilities to see much more what happens afterwards. All right, I'm gonna skip to this. So this is my last little example. This is mostly a fun one. We've talked about extreme ways of being. One of the things that's kind of interesting among frogs in terms of extremes are big things and little things. So this is the world's biggest frog. This is a Goliath frog. They're found only in Cameroon and mainland Equatorial Guinea in Central Africa. They are big frogs. They tend to be photographed next to small men. This is the Baaka, part of the what we call colloquially pygmies. So they are a big frog, a very big frog. So basically the size of like a small human baby. And they usually weigh about the same amount. Well, on the other end of the scale are extremely tiny frogs. Unlike, I often lecture to much younger audiences. So I'm glad here that people know that this is a dime. This is a form of currency, and this is a pencil. So I don't need to explain that. But these are very tiny animals, and we see these tiny animals in many different parts of the world. So this is a frog from Madagascar. This is a frog from Brazil. This is a frog from Papua New Guinea. They don't have anything to do with each other, and they're not in the same families. They're not closely related to each other. We see this again and again. We tend to think about specialization and miniaturization as being an adaptation to something, and probably is in these cases. They live really tiny, they eke out an existence on very tiny animals and very tiny specific pieces of the habitat. But there's other things about this that are a trade-off. That sometimes when you adapt an extreme lifestyle, that you give up some other things that you do well, for instance. And so this was a fun project we published earlier this year. So this is a typical frog. This is often how frog biologists study. This is a video from above and a video from the side. So what happens, this is a very typical frog jump. They leap with their legs, they put their hands out, they land. I'll just play it again because it matters to the next image. So, this is a very typical frog. They're able to tell what they're doing because, just like us, they have an inner ear. And so they can sense, how they're moving through space and right themselves as they're going through. So what's quite fun about these tiny frogs, it's this. So here's a frog. These are frogs from Brazil. They're very bad. And in fact, every species in this group, they're all tiny. They'd all more or less fit on my thumbnail. None of them can land. They can all jump just fine, but none of them can stick the landing, which is quite interesting because it's something we think of as a very frog thing to do, is jumping. And these frogs are remarkably bad. Now, I'll add that these frogs are probably not hurt by this. Most of the time they live in the leaves. So, if they're jumping and they hit another leaf, they're fine. I'm sure they can right themselves quickly and then move on with their lives. But we were curious, well, how could it be that these frogs are so bad at this? And one of the things that we were really interested in were these inner ears. So it turns out that, an inner ear, so we have 70 canals of your inner ear, one that goes to the side, two that kind of go from the top. These are, as we move our heads, this is how we sense where we are in space, right? We have fluid that moves through tubes, and that helps us actually position ourselves, we know where our head is related to the ground. It turns out the tubes in these frogs' ears are so small that they're actually right at the boundary of the physical limits of how we think liquid moves through tubes. So we actually think that what's happening is that the liquid in the inner ear is just not able to move efficiently through these tubes. And so the frogs actually have no sense really of where they are once they leave the ground. There's other ideas that could help to explain some of this, but this seems very real. And what's kind of neat is that at some point, frogs, these are tadpoles and fish, at some point, frogs get the ability to do this. And we've seen this experimentally with tadpoles. These adult frogs are basically at or below the boundary of what we expect even from tadpoles. So they seem to be functioning right at the boundaries of, could they be smaller? Maybe, but it also might mean that they're actually bumping up against physical limitations that if they were any smaller, their bodies wouldn't quite work in the same way that a normal frog body would work. So it's kind of fun, fascinating, and I think really kind of shows that our ability to work with animals experimentally and see inside them actually opens up these interesting opportunities for kind of rethinking what we think we know about a lot of these animals. That's all I have for you, but I'm more than happy to chat about frogs or anything else you'd like. Thanks.
Hello? Hello? Got me? Probably, so we don't, well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I hardly know where to begin with questions, but I'd like to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Blackburn. Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure exactly how that was doing. But you're talking about semicircular canals and they get too small. And we're looking at everything from a wheel. So the real question is the consequences of what we think of being too small, but we're extrapolating from all of experience.
True. I think that's always a constraint in studying other organisms is that we're stuck with our perspective. Sometimes it's confining because it's very hard to imagine the world from another animal. I think, in this case, the best we can do sometimes is either some combination of experimentation in this case, and that's, I think we can explain what we see that way, but it also doesn't say much about, any consequence of the frog. I actually don't think it matters for the frog, to be honest. I think they're so tiny, they jump, they're fine. They don't, not worried. I think a big frog would actually be a much bigger problem if the frog wasn't able to jump and land, but these tiny frogs, I don't think so. That's a good point.
Thank you. You showed earlier a large circle with a single origin. What was that original ancestor of all these frogs?
Good question. A frog. It was a frog. It was, as far as we can tell, a pretty general type of frog. Even for the fossil record, as we go back into the Jurassic and the Triassic, so 150, 200 million years ago, a lot of those frogs are what we today think of as very generalist frogs. So it seems like a lot of the specialization that's happened has been much more recent than the terms of the last 100 million years. So the first, third to half of sort of frog history, most of the species that we see in the fossil record or we infer might have been there are pretty basic, run-of-the-mill type general frogs. But then the second half is full of all these specializations in the tree frogs and burrowing frogs and aquatic frogs. If that makes sense. Does that make more sense? Or were you asking a different question?
We believe that the birds we see today, their ancestors were some kind of dinosaur.
True.
So I'm asking this similar question.
Got it.
What was there before the frog?
Got it. So the nearest relatives that are alive today of frogs are salamanders. And so there is the closest we have to a frog that's not a frog is a frog that is an animal that has a lot of froggy features. It has fewer vertebrae, it has short arms, has big feet, but yet it doesn't have all those features. It really looks like a salamander trying to be a frog, for lack of a better word. And in fact, a few other fossils that have been described you know, they sort of fall in the branches in between. They have been colloquially referred to things as frogamander, you know, something that's, but I mean, that's basically it. We're working from a body form that looked probably very similar to a salamander, and probably had biology quite similar to a salamander. Remember, salamanders also have larvae, you know, they do go through metamorphosis. Clearly, one of the things that's most specialized about frogs are also tadpoles. So early on in the history, we have both of those things happening. We have these tadpoles evolving, which are quite different from salamanders, right? They look strange, they look more like a fish, but they're very different from fish. And we have this adult body form, and those two things go together. And unfortunately, we actually have relatively few transitional forms in there. I mean, one of the problems is probably these are actually very small animals. Very small animals tend to have a very bad fossil record. The very few bits we have are often isolated pieces. So it makes it hard. The earliest froggy, not a frog, is actually a fossil from Madagascar. There's only one of them, and it's about this big. It's a relatively small animal in the fossil. And you know, for lack of a better explanation, it looks sort of like a salamander, sort of like a frog. So that's sort of where we're going from in order to get to.
We have a chat question here. Are any of our local frogs poisonous in terms of handling them?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, let's see. The best way to answer that is yes, in a technical sense. So most frogs, even poison dart frogs, if you handle them, they're not going to hurt, especially if you wash your hands. Almost any single frog you touch will secrete things out of its skin. Now, most of those are not really of any consequence at all to us as humans, but many of them can be irritating. So even you pick up a Cuban tree frog, you picked it up, you moved it somewhere, and then you weren't paying attention, you wiped your eye. Bet later your eye will be very burny for a bit. You're not going to lose your eyesight or anything like that. It's like an irritant. So they create these irritants. The same is true for toads. That's often most familiar to people. So toads have these big glands right behind their head, these two toads. They secrete a substance out of them that's sort of milky looking. That not only will be noxious, it will taste bad. They often tend to be irritating to membrane. So like in your mouth or in your eye, they will have a burning sensation. In terms of poisonous at a human health level, avoid eating live frogs.
You heard it here first.
I think if you can handle that, you're probably all right, you know, and so that's very true. There are a few frogs that are extremely toxic. So even if you're handling them, you know, by skin, it could be dangerous. So there are some poison dart frogs, especially these ones that are bright yellow and orange that actually make a lot of toxins, including tetrodotoxins, the same type of stuff you find in like pufferfish, if you know those are sushi. Those same toxins actually appear sometimes in frogs. So in that case, they are toxic. I think for local frogs, your biggest worry is getting things on your hand that when you stick it in your mouth or your eye will either be irritating or taste terrible. So if you can avoid that, I think that's
No frog licking.
that's best. Don't frog lick. Actually, interestingly, you know, frogs are used for other toxins, and so there are toads, especially toads, that have been used as hallucinogenics. So there are communities that have used toad venom to smoke before as a hallucinogenic. So there are other uses out there in the world for frog chemicals. But also, I'll just add that it's easy to have the human perspective of viewing these chemicals as bad. But there's two other additions to this. One is that, in fact, those are defenses of these animals, right? So these are their natural defenses, not only for preventing, say, us from eating them, but also from these chemicals often have antimicrobial properties to them. So they're actually, remember, frog skin is soft, it's delicate. One of their primary things to defend is, in fact, their skin, not only from their skin being eaten, but also from stuff growing on their skin. They don't want that to happen. So a lot of these compounds that are created and put on the skin have antimicrobial, antifungal properties. And so because of that, those same things that might taste bad or be terrible in your eye are also actually of interest to a lot of scientists, because understanding what the properties of those compounds are can be interesting in terms of developing antibiotics and antifungals.
Okay, we have a question here.
Oh, yeah. Jim.
Hi, so this is kind of in the weeds about, I've watched a lot of toads, swallowing, and they usually, their eyes sort of disappear, and that wasn't a part of your,
I did not explain it that way. Yep. So that's actually quite interesting. All the toads, so these toads ate voracious. In fact, the study we didn't talk about also involved bullfrogs, which is a totally different group of frogs, and a tomato frog from Madagascar, which is yet another group of frogs. All of them have different types of tongues. That was the value of studying them. The cane toads eat on demand. You put a cricket in front of them, they eat immediately. Bullfrogs very shy. Tomato frogs basically can eat on camera no matter what. What's interesting is that bullfrogs have been studied before for this, and it seems that it has been put forward that bullfrogs are actually, quote, swallowing somehow using their eyes when they close their eyes. Not only are they closed, but they're actually pushing them down into the mouth. That somehow that's part of the process of swallowing or getting prey off the tongue. What's interesting about the cane toads, and we see this like literally hundreds of times, is that they actually close their eyes before they even shoot their tongue. And their eyes are closed the entire time until they basically swallow. And as far as we can tell, the eyes don't play any role in swallowing. Now, that's not to refute these ideas about bullfrogs, but it probably opens the possibility that there's a lot of frogs out there. There are probably ways of doing this that did vary by different groups. I mean, that's obvious from the point of view of mammals. Not all mammals eat and swallow in the same way. We tend to not think about that in terms of frogs. So it might be that some groups like bullfrogs are actually using their eyes as part of swallowing, but other groups like cane toads do it a totally different way.
So I've got a question too. So I guess, we're just here as a blip in time, hundreds of millions of years of all these different evolutionary adaptations, but I wondered if you're noticing with any particular species with global warming, if you're starting to see any specific adaptations on any frogs.
Yeah, actually, we do begin. It's actually, first of all, I'll say in the terms of frog biology, it tends to not be something that's been focused on a lot. However, some of the areas in which we do start seeing what we think of as happening to be adaptation are a couple. So one is, which I didn't talk about at all. Probably many of you know that frogs and amphibians in general are in decline. One of the things that has caused that is the spread of a fungus that infects their skin. So we actually have seen things to be adaptation happening related to that. We have frogs that seem at even a genetic level, especially in genes related to disease defense, that we think we see populations that are evolving, basically in response to this pathogen. So we do see that. In terms of climate change and global warming is honestly a little hard to study right now for amphibians. But one of the ways that we see that maybe most concretely isn't really related to climate change per se, but to urbanization. So we actually do see frogs persist in some of the biggest cities in the world, right? That means they change what time of day they call, because there's a lot more light pollution. So they start shifting. And now whether or not this is an adaptation in terms of genetics or this is somehow learned, a little unclear. Probably, since there's not a lot of learning often in frogs, this is probably something that populations are slowly evolving. So you see frogs persisting in some of the biggest cities of the world, altering what time of day they call it. When are they active? Probably, and this is something that's not well studied in frogs, but is in invertebrates. They're probably also adapting to dealing with a lot of water pollution. Heavy metals that are in waterways. Even in Central Park, there's probably 3 species of frogs that persist in Central Park, which is kind of wild if you think about it. There's not really a pristine habitat, and we have a couple species eking out a living. And that's the same for major cities like Shanghai and other places. You find little pockets, and those are probably examples where it's
Probably for
adapt or go. Yes, yeah, exactly. So
Okay, and because I'm from the College of Dentistry, I would be remiss if I didn't ask at least one question about teeth.
Sure.
So you showed a odontoid fang. So was that from one of your big headed? Is that one of the lower jaws?
Yep. Sorry, great question. Yes. So one of the things that we see on frogs that don't have, since basically, 7,500 species of frogs don't have teeth on their lower jaws. One of the things that we see a lot of times in these large-headed frogs, especially ones that eat big vertebrates, but also sometimes in males that fight, and they fight one another, we actually see them get these bony tooth-like processes on their lower jaws. They're not teeth, they're just bony spikes. And so we see that a lot of times in these big-headed ones that are eating very large prey, probably for helping to hold on to a struggling prey. We also see it in a few groups of frogs where males fight, and they fight by biting each other. So that the females don't have them, but the males will actually have these very sharp little spikes on their lower jaws. Not true teeth.
Yes, I was interested in the lack of diversity of species before 65 million years ago. And, so is that because predation by dinosaurs or different climate?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's probably that lack of diversity is because it's very hard for us to see. And so if we look and that sort of tree of evolutionary relationships is all based on living species. So it's based on only living species. It's impossible for us to infer extinct lineages, basically, because it's just not represented among the diversity of lineages that are here today. It's very hard, and it has been hard, to actually sort of describe the variation of frog diversity in the past, especially for lineages that don't have any descendants today. My guess is, and it seems to be true, is that there are plenty of frogs. A lot of times, though, those are very partial fossils, and we have a very hard time saying, oh, that's the frog that's in this family. Like, they're just bits and pieces of frogs. All we can tell often is they look like a frog. And it's very hard to say anything more. So we actually have a lot of projects that are kind of focused exactly on that question and trying to understand it. Previously, it's been thought like, hey, amphibians are great survivors. They have a fossil record going back 200 million years. We've had big extinction events and they're still here. Seems fine. Probably not really the whole story. Probably that there has been a dramatic effects of, mass extinction events, periods of time of, intense global warming or cooling. Those probably have mattered. But they're just hard for us to infer and see. So now that we have these libraries of all frog diversity and skeletons, it makes it a little easier for us to go back to the fossil record and actually try to figure out what these things are and say something a little more concrete about was there a change in the types of species or the number of species before and after an extinction event? So we're sort of just on the cusp of doing that.
Julian, is there
Tom George, if you can hear me, did you have a question?
It was already answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we'll let Dr. Blackburn get away.
Thanks for your talk. Assuming you're in the frog lover fraternity, how many others are in that fraternity? How do you communicate? And what all sort of synergism do you have going ahead for you?
That's great. I was actually remarking before we got here about, now we live in this world of Zoom and people are online and people are here. There's frustrations about that, but some of the nice parts about that is that it's easier than ever for us to communicate with people that do what we do on the other side of the world. So on campus, we have quite a number of people that study amphibians and reptiles, probably about a dozen faculty, one way or the other. But when we publish science, we regularly publish science most of the time with scientists somewhere else in the world. And so there's a lot of us, hundreds, at least, thousands of people that specialize in amphibians and reptiles. And interestingly enough, the pandemic in some ways sort of forcing people to communicate more online. We've had online conferences. We had the first ever global tadpole conference, which had never happened ever before, during the middle of the pandemic online. Because of course, it's like, well, there's only a couple tadpole people. Or, you go to a meeting about frogs and lizards, there's like 2 tadpole people and they hang out. Because there are many, but they're scattered everywhere. And so it was kind of a cool experience having an all online, all tadpoles conference for 2 days that had, must have 50 to 100 people participating from all over the world. And As frustrating as depending on Zoom and things can be, it also has been an interesting way to unite people doing the same thing from all over the place. And sometimes it opens the door for in-person interactions. And so I just got back from Germany. While I was in Germany, I think I met 3 or 4 different people, all of whom I met during the pandemic, who've been communicating with, but we've never met. A couple of them we've even published papers. And so, you know, we have that now. I mean, sort of a curse, but it's also a benefit that we can communicate, you know, with people around the world online now.
A short question and a longer question. The short question is, do you have some frogs that actually land properly and then walk away or leap some more?
Definitely.
Okay, and then the other one is frog legs that we eat and their production. What kind of frogs and where?
Frog legs that we eat. So yeah, that's interesting. So in the United States, my understanding is that most frogs that are eaten in the United States are bullfrogs. So Ronacopsiana, things we plant outside. Interestingly, though, if you were to eat bullfrogs in the state of Florida, my guess is none of those come from the state of Florida. Almost all of those frogs that we have in the United States are actually imported from China. So, which is, these are American frogs. Frogs that literally we could go outside and catch right now, are raised in China and then imported into the United States. There's a lot of reasons. This is complicated and might not be what we want. One of the things that's actually interesting is that a lot of times there's live imports. And regardless of where you are in the world, these frog farms are basically just like centers of disease, right? And so especially for this fungus that causes frog declines around the world, these frog farms in places like China or Southeast Asia have enormous high loads of these pathogens. Bring these live animals back, and we're actually bringing back in this disease back to the insects. Depending on where you are in the world, though, you actually eat very different frogs. And so there are a lot of bullfroggy-like frogs that are eaten across West Africa, across Southern Asia. None of those frogs are actually bullfrogs. None of them are close related to each other. We tend as humans to like large aquatic frogs for whatever reason. Nobody likes burrowing frogs. There's no like special delicacy. Yeah.
All right, I think we have one last question and
Yeah, so it's mentioned that you do a lot of work with molecular genetics. Maybe I was asleep, but I didn't hear any of that.
I didn't talk about it.
And the question, I wasn't asleep, otherwise I would have understood it. In fact, the question is, although you have these problems with life policy, if you look at the DNA sequence analyses, do you see any kind of evolutionary convergence or a common start point?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, so do you mean in terms of sort of similar, you see the same molecular genetics features evolving, or something like that? No.
Like viral plays?
Yeah, so I mean, that's basically one of the main ways we use DNA data in our lab and for the museum is sort of figuring out those patterns of relationships based on DNA data. One of the exciting things about genomics becoming a lot more accessible to things outside of humans is that we can begin asking questions that are not just who's related to who, but we can actually ask a lot more questions at a molecular level about adaptation, right? And hybridization, exchange of genes between populations. And so we do spend a lot of time doing that type of work. I think one of the most exciting things is it's becoming more tractable for us to connect genetic variation to phenotype, trait variation. That's been something that we've waved our arms around a lot for the last 50 years. And now we're right on the edge of being able, I mean, we can do this in a lot of groups, but in amphibians, it's been hard because amphibians have huge genomes. So getting genomic data for amphibians has been really hard because the genome, even of these tiny frogs, are way bigger than our genomes. And so trying to capture that DNA and sequence that DNA is very challenging. But even now for things with bigger genomes, we're beginning to be able to connect genomic variation to trait variation. That's interesting. That's kind of neat because it gets us to more of a mechanistic view
Some have mitochondria.
They have mitochondria, just like us.
So if you were concentrate on mitochondrial sequences, which make what some.
True. Yes, there's some questions we can't really ask about, genetic variation. But there has been, for instance, work to look at adaptation, say, in mitochondria related to how the cell is using oxygen. So for high elevation populations where oxygen levels are lower, you actually do begin seeing an adaptation in mitochondria related to more efficiently making use of oxygen. Mitochondria are nice because they're actually small in terms of genes, right?
I say that because that was the original way in which the argument was made that we are all derived from by being out of Africa.
All right, well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you very much, Dr. Blackburn, for a fascinating lot today. Everybody, next week we'll be back in the Oak Room and we'll be talking about the Indian people of the Army. So please join us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming.